Kia koto tamariki ma. Little lesson here. We're going to talk about fractions. First off, we want to know that a fraction is a way that we can describe a part of a whole, a piece of something. Okay, and that thing we should know is defined to have a numerator and denominator. Go ahead and add that to your notes, the definition of a numerator, which is the number of pieces I have, and the denominator tells us how many pieces are in the whole thing. So a fraction like 1/3 is going to be one part out of the whole thing. Now, if we want to add fractions together, 1/3 plus another third, that will give us 2/3. Subtracting a third from a third, you'd have no thirds or 0. We'll talk about multiplying and dividing in a moment. Right now, I want to look at this visually. So if you're adding some fractions together, 1/3 plus a third, well, that gives us 2/3. And visually, I've shaded in 1/3 out of the whole thing. If I added another third to that, now I've got 2/3. And of course, subtracting them, subtracted, it's gone, there's nothing left. Now, multiplying. In mathematics, when we multiply, we often use times, but let's look visually at something real quick. Now, multiplying, if I were talked about half of a half, we understand conceptually exactly what a half is. This piece right here is shaded half of a whole. So this is half of one whole, which you could think of as 1/2 times 1/2 of one whole. Now, if I say half of a half, people usually say, yeah, well, half of a half is a quarter. Let's look at that visually. There's 1/2 we shaded in from before. If I took this half and cut it in half, what's left is a quarter. So how I want you guys to think about this mathematically, when we say half times 1/2, that's what it means visually. And remember, the word of in mathematics means to times. That's why a half times a half is a quarter. Now, if we extended that to thirds, you know, they're shaded as 1/3. If I take that third, find 1/3 of it, a third of a third is a 1/9. And there we see a 1/9 shaded in. So mathematically, when you multiply, just multiply the numbers. 3 times 3 is 9. 1 times 1 is 1. Now, going back to adding, this only works when you've got the same denominator in a fraction. And we said before, the denominator is that number on the bottom. All right, that's your denominator. So I'll have another lesson on working with the fractions. But for now, the easiest thing to remember, just use your graphics calculator. It's going to be the easiest way to solve these problems. And just remember to put brackets around the fractions. You need to tell your calculator what part of it is a fraction. So what I want you to always do, put the brackets around each of your fractions. That way the calculator understands how to do it. And I want to encourage you to grab your graphics calculator in brackets. 1/3 plus 1/3 equals, and you get 2/3. You want to simplify those fractions. We know how to use the S to D button there. That's the way that we can simplify a fraction to a decimal and back. Make sure you can get those. Now, lastly, I'm going to talk about dividing by a fraction. And what I need you to remember when you're dividing by a fraction, all you want to remember is this. Dividing by a fraction is the same as multiplying by its reciprocal. So I want you to add this to your notes, that if you're going to be dividing by a fraction, that is equal to, get this in your notes, dividing by a fraction is equal to multiplying by the reciprocal of the second fraction and only the second fraction. That's going to be the mechanics of it. So if you had a question like 1/3 divided by 1/3, whenever you're dividing by a fraction, what I want you to do is just automatically change it to, instead of dividing, we times, and this second fraction, and only this second fraction, you take what's known as the reciprocal, where you just flip it. 1/3 becomes 3/1. So timesing by 3/1 is the exact same thing as dividing by 1/3. Okay, that's what you're going to remember when it comes to dividing with fractions. Automatically change it from divided to times, reciprocal of that one, and divide. One should make sense. 1/3 divided by 1/3. How many times does 1/3 go into itself? Well, once. Reason we know that is because dividing by a fraction is equal to multiplying by the reciprocal of the second fraction and only the second fraction. One more example, and only the reciprocal of the second fraction. If I asked you, what's 2/3 divided by 1/3? So how many times does 1/3 go into 2/3? Well, hopefully you're thinking it goes in twice, and let's show why. Dividing by 1/3 is the same as timesing by the reciprocal. We know from that last problem, when you multiply fractions, 2 times 3 is 6, 3 times 1 is 3. If you put that in your calculator, it'll simplify and give you 2. Okay, and that's a little intro on what we should know on fractions.